Hi guys, and welcome to Last Light Radio Channel. Tonight we step into the sharp, breath-stealing cold of the Old West, where winter is not just a season, but a quiet challenger waiting outside your door. You can almost see the prairie under a pale sky, feel the boards under your boots, and hear the wind testing every seam of your little shelter as if it already knows your weak points. It is easy to picture the frontier as a place of bright sun, dusty trails, and wide heroic hats. But what happens when the grass turns brittle, the water skins over with ice, and the whole land seems to hold its breath? What did it really mean to stay alive when warmth itself became precious? So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and tell me your location and local time in the comments, because I always love seeing where in the world you are listening from. Now, dim the lights, and you arrive on the plains at the worst possible moment, which is exactly how these things often happened. You do not reach the frontier in a blaze of triumph. You arrive tired, stiff, and dusty, with fingers that already ache from the cold. Your wagon looks smaller now that it stands under an enormous sky. The land around you seems endless at first glance, but the first frost changes that illusion. Suddenly the world feels close and narrow. The air bites your nose, the grass crackles underfoot, your breath hangs in front of you like a little ghost that keeps trying to leave. This is your first real lesson. Winter on the frontier does not announce itself with drama right away. It begins with small humiliations. The wash water chills your hands raw, the morning basin carries a sheet of ice, the tin cup stings your lips. You wake in the dark because the cold has found your feet, and you lie still for a moment, bargaining with yourself before climbing from bed. Very glamorous, exactly the kind of adventure the land agents forgot to paint on their posters. In many parts of the Old West, especially the Great Plains, settlers reached open country with grand expectations and very little protection. Brochures and railroad advertisements had promised rich soil, open opportunity, and a chance to begin again. That part was not entirely false. The soil could be good. Opportunity did exist. But no cheerful pamphlet could fully explain what it felt like when the wind came at your house all night long and refused to stop. Historians generally agree that many newcomers underestimated winter because they imagined the West through summer travel accounts, not through the hard arithmetic of January survival. You learn quickly that every object now belongs to the cold. The door latch is cold. The spoon is cold. The bed frame is cold. Your boots are cold before you put them on. Even the light seems cold, sliding through the cracks in the wall with a pale and unsympathetic look. You move more slowly, not because you're lazy, but because each task has grown heavier. Carrying water means breaking ice. Feeding stock means facing the wind before dawn. Washing clothes means choosing between frozen fingers and a growing pile of dirt. At first the prairie still looks beautiful. That is the trap. The mornings can open with a silver glow across the grass, and the horizon stretches clean and pure, as if the whole country has been polished overnight. You hear crows in the distance. You smell smoke from your own fire mixed with damp earth and animal hide. There is a calm to it that almost persuades you everything will be manageable. Then the day turns, wind freshens, and the cold begins crawling inside your sleeves. Your shelter matters more than almost anything. Yet many first homes are painfully crude. On the plains, some families live in dugouts cut into a bank, half room and half burrow. Others raise simple wooden cabins if lumber can be hauled in. Some make do with canvas for longer than they ever intended. A few move into sod houses built from blocks of earth and prairie grass. Those sod homes could be warmer than flimsy board shacks, though they came with their own charms, such as dirt falling into your stew and insects deciding they were also paying rent. You do not get to be fussy. Winter has no patience for aesthetic concerns. The sounds of your dwelling become familiar very quickly. The boards tick in the night. The roof mutters under frost. Wind combs along the walls with a dry, whispering rasp. Sometimes it rises into a long moan that makes the whole place seem thinner than paper. You listen from under blankets and understand, in a way that city people rarely need to understand. that a house is not abstract. It is a physical argument between your body and the weather. You spend daylight reading signs. The clouds thicken in the west. The air feels sharper by noon. The animals shift uneasily. Chickens fluff themselves into absurd little spheres. Horses lower their heads and turn their backs to the breeze. Cattle crowd together when the cold deepens. You watch them because their discomfort is your warning. Livestock on the frontier were wealth, labour, transport, and future meals all wrapped into one shivering investment. Keeping them alive through winter was not just kindness, it was economics with hooves. There is a stubborn mythology around frontier toughness, as if every settler strode into hardship with cheerful grit and a noble jawline. In truth, many people were frightened, and with good reason. Winter on the plains could turn a confident newcomer into an anxious weather watcher within days. The distances between homes were often large. Supplies might be limited. Roads became uncertain. A simple illness could become dangerous once snow, mud, and freezing wind slowed every movement. Courage mattered, yes, but so did luck, timing, and whether your flour barrel had been filled before the weather closed in. The first nights are the hardest because darkness arrives so early and seems so complete. You feel it at supper when the light drains from the window. The room glows with lamplight or firelight, and beyond that small circle is only black glass and the restless dark. You hear the stove breathe. You smell grease, smoke, damp wool, and the faint sourness of wet leather drying too close to the heat. Someone shifts on a chair. A child coughs. A kettle gives a tiny rattle. Small household sounds grow large because there is nowhere else for your mind to go. One quirky frontier tidbit still feels almost unbelievable today. In treeless areas, settlers sometimes twisted dried animal manure, especially buffalo chips or cow chips, into a dependable household fuel. It burned hotter than you might guess and became a perfectly ordinary part of a life on the plains. You may have crossed half a continent dreaming of fertile land and freedom, only to spend a freezing morning collecting patties from a field. History has a sense of humour, and it is often very dry. The body changes first, then the mind. Your skin roughens, your knuckles split, your nose runs in the cold and stings by the stove. You start measuring time by chores and fuel rather than by clock hours. You think about how much daylight remains. You think about whether the water bucket is full. You think about the draft under the door. Comfort shrinks into a few simple pleasures: warm broth, dry socks, a chair near the fire, sleep without waking to shiver. Food becomes emotionally important in winter because it is not just food, it is reassurance. A pot of beans simmering means heat as well as supper. Biscuits or cornbread mean the oven is working. Salt pork sizzling in a pan fills the room with a smell that briefly overpowers the scent of smoke and damp clothes. You stand near it longer than necessary, warming your hands and pretending you're merely being helpful. On the frontier, appetite and morale held hands. Not everyone experienced winter the same way, and that matters. Long before waves of settlers arrived, indigenous peoples across the West had deep knowledge of seasonal survival, movement, shelter, hunting, clothing, and landscape. Many newcomers survived partly by learning local realities from those who already understood them. Yet settler accounts often downplayed that dependence, which is a very human habit. People do love to describe themselves as entirely self-made while quietly borrowing useful wisdom from their neighbours. Still, even with advice, uncertainty remained. Scholars continue to debate how often published pioneer recollections exaggerated hardship for dramatic effect, especially when written decades later for children or local histories. Memory can turn every snowdrift into a mountain, and every meal into a noble struggle. At the same time, surviving records make clear that conditions were often brutally difficult. So the exact shade of misery may vary from account to account, but the misery itself is not in doubt. The morning routine teaches you that survival is built from repetition. You rise before full light. You dress fast because the room is cold. Your clothing feels stiff where yesterday's dampness dried. You step onto a floor that sends a shock through your soles. Outside, the world smells clean in the severe way only frozen air can smell clean, with traces of smoke, manure, and distant snow. The silence is not complete. there is always something. A horse snorts, a hinge squeals, frozen grass hisses under your steps. You pump or carry water if you can. You break ice if you must. You feed animals. You check for damage. You gather fuel. You return indoors with red hands and a face so numb it barely feels attached. Then the thaw begins under your skin, and that may hurt more than the cold itself. Needles of sensation prick your fingers. Your cheeks burn. You hold a tin cup of something hot and let the warmth spread slowly upward, as if your body is remembering how to be human. Children on the frontier experienced winter with a strange mix of wonder and labor. Snow could be magical, of course. Ice could glitter like treasure. A frozen pond invited dangerous temptation. But children also hauled kindling, fetched water, tended siblings, mended clothes, and learned very early that storms ignored birthdays and excuses. Some memoirs describe youngsters stuffing cracks in walls with rags or paper, or sleeping several to a bed for warmth. Childhood did not disappear in winter. It simply put on mittens and got to work. The emotional strain builds quietly. You may miss noise. You may miss company. You may even miss the nuisance of crowded streets, because loneliness has a way of making old annoyances look charming. Out here, a visitor can feel like a festival. A letter is treasure. News arrives late and thin. The weather dominates every conversation because the weather dominates every choice. You begin to understand why small setbacks could provoke large feelings. A broken harness, a sick calf, a drafty window, a sack of flour spoiled by damp. None of these are minor when the season is long, and yet people kept going. That is perhaps the most remarkable part. They complained, improvised, argued, repaired, cooked, patched, prayed, and endured. They laughed too, often at absurd moments. Humour was one more tool against winter. When your roof leaks dirt into the beans, when your boots freeze stiff, when the wind blows smoke back down the stovepipe and turns supper into a coughing fit. Sarcasm becomes a kind of frontier medicine. Not very scientific, perhaps, still effective. By the time the first true cold settles in, you no longer think of winter as scenery. You think of it as pressure. It presses on the walls, the animals, the food supply, the firewood, and your patience. It tests whether your shelter is real, whether your planning was sound, and whether your spirit can stay steady when the horizon goes white and the nights feel twice as long. The Old West in winter is not a postcard of noble stillness. It is a place of creaking boards, smoky clothes, cracked hands, and stubborn routine. You survive it first by noticing, then by adapting, and then by accepting that every ordinary task now carries the weight of necessity. That is how the season begins for you. Not with heroic music, but with frost on the bucket, smoke in the rafters, and the cold finding every weakness before breakfast. The house begins as an idea long before it becomes shelter. You stand in the open with a measuring eye, looking at sky, ground, and wind, and trying to imagine which patch of earth might offend winter the least. That is the first trick. You do not build to please yourself. You build to resist what is coming. The prairie is broad, bare, and unimpressed by your plans. It offers space. Yes, but not much mercy. At first glance, the land can seem simple. The grass lies low. The horizon stretches flat. A few distant cottonwoods might trace a creek bed, and a rise in the ground might look useful from afar. Then you begin to notice details that matter in cold weather. Where does the wind hit hardest? Which hollow collects drifting snow? Which side of a slope offers a little protection? Does the soil stay firm after freeze and thaw? Is there water close enough to reach, but not so close that everything turns to mud in a brief winter melt? A poor sight can make every storm feel personal. Many settlers in the Old West had to build fast, often with limited tools and even more limited time. That urgency shaped the look of frontier homes. There was rarely room for architectural vanity. A family might arrive in late summer or autumn and scramble to put up anything with walls before the serious cold arrived. The result could be a one-room cabin, a dugout cut into a bank, or a sod house carved from the prairie itself. The style depended less on taste than on whatever the land and wagon could provide. A graceful front porch was lovely in theory. A roof that did not blow off was better. If timber is available, you feel blessed for about 5 minutes, then overwhelmed. Trees mean cutting, trimming, hauling, notching, stacking, and praying your walls fit together tightly enough to keep out the wind. Even a modest cabin demands labor that seems to multiply by the hour. Each log must be handled several times. Each gap between logs becomes a threat. You stuff those seams with moss, clay, mud, or strips of cloth in a process called chinking. The word sounds almost cheerful. The work is not. Your fingers go numb, your back protests, the mud freezes on your gloves. Still, every sealed crack is a little victory. When timber is scarce, the prairie forces creativity. Sod houses became one of the most practical answers on the Great Plains, where grass roots held the earth together in thick, dense mats. You cut the sod into blocks and stack them like bricks, making walls that are heavy, quiet, and surprisingly effective against cold. A well-built sod house can stay warmer in winter and cooler in summer than a flimsy board shack. It also introduces a few domestic charms that would not make it into a railroad brochure. Bits of dirt may drift down from the ceiling. After rain, the smell of wet earth settles indoors. Mice can take an entrepreneurial interest in the premises. Occasionally, so can insects. You tell yourself this is rustic authenticity. The touch of these homes is unforgettable. A log wall feels rough and dry beneath your hand. Chinking crumbles if done poorly. Sod walls are dense and faintly damp, with a softness under the palm that reminds you your house was recently part of a field. The floor might be packed earth, rough planks, or whatever uneven compromise daily life can tolerate. Nothing is polished. Nothing is decorative unless someone has made beauty from scraps. Perhaps a cloth pinned near a bed or a shelf, carefully arranged with a few treasured objects. Warmth is the main luxury. Everything else is extra. Roofing becomes its own frontier drama. A roof must shed snow, resist wind, and keep out damp, all while being built from materials that are rarely ideal. Boards, shingles, sod, canvas, poles, and tar paper all appear in various combinations depending on place and means. A sod roof can insulate well, but it is heavy and may leak if laid badly. A thin wooden roof may groan in high wind and let in drafts that travel down into the room with infuriating precision. At night you listen upward, learning to tell the difference between harmless creaks and more serious sounds. The house talks constantly. You become a reluctant expert in its moods. Doors and windows deserve suspicion. A door that hangs slightly wrong can invite a stream of cold air strong enough to chill the whole room. Windows are useful for light, but glass is fragile, expensive, and often small. Some homes have oiled paper in place of proper panes. Others have glass that rattles in the frame whenever the wind rises. Frost blooms across the inside surface in pale feathers and fern-like patterns. Beautiful in the way trouble often is. You admire it for a moment, then press a rag into the sill because the draft is finding your ankles again. One mainstream historical fact stands out in nearly every account of frontier building. On the plains, many families spent their earliest months or even their first winter in dugouts. These were homes excavated into hillsides or banks, with a front wall and a roof added to create a partly underground shelter. Dugouts were not glamorous, but they used the earth itself as insulation. In severe weather, practicality tends to win arguments. You may dream of a fine house one day, but winter teaches you to value anything that blocks the wind and holds heat. Inside, the arrangement of the room reveals what matters. The stove or fireplace claims the center of emotional gravity even when it stands against a wall. Beds are placed where drafts seem less vicious. Blankets hang as makeshift barriers. Boxes become chairs. Crates become tables. Shelves are precious because they lift food and tools away from dirt, damp, and opportunistic rodents. The room smells of smoke, wool, leather, lamp oil, flour, and occasionally wet dog. That smell settles into clothing and bedding until the entire household carries the scent of survival. The soundscape is never truly silent. Wind scratches at the roof, fire pops and hisses, A loose shutter claps out a complaint. Floorboards answer your steps. A kettle lid chatters softly when water warms. In a sod house, outside noise can seem muffled in a strangely comforting way, as if the earth itself is cupping its hands around you. In a thin shack, every gust feels intimate. The walls shiver, the nails complain. You lie awake hearing the weather move around you like an animal testing a pen. Building against the wind also means shaping daily habits around the structure's weaknesses. You hang quilts over doors, you roll cloth against the threshold, you keep a box near the coldest corner because it is slightly less unpleasant than sitting there yourself. You learn which places on the floor stay icy longest, and which patch near the stove is worth defending with quiet determination. Even a small room develops climates of its own. One side chills milk, another side bakes boots too fast if they are set carelessly near the stove. There is also the matter of smoke, which frontier houses could never quite treat with full respect. Chimneys were tricky. Stovepipes needed the right draft. A sudden shift in wind could push smoke back into the room, turning supper into a tearful affair. Eyes sting. The air thickens. The walls take on a dark film over time. You cough, open the door for a reckless moment, then rush to close it again because all the precious heat is fleeing. Clean indoor air was not always guaranteed. It was another ideal that winter liked to mock. A quirky tidbit from the period captures the odd intimacy between people and their homes. In some sod houses, grass on the roof could sprout in warm weather, and chickens or even small animals might wander across the top, as if the house were simply a slightly elevated patch of prairie. Imagine sitting indoors while faint scratching overhead reminds you that your roof is technically alive. Charming in theory. Less charming when bits of soil land in the stew. Still, frontier people were experts at pretending a nuisance was merely character. Historians still debate how comfortable sod houses truly were in practice, because accounts vary widely. Some memoirs describe them as cosy and protective once properly finished. Others paint them as damp, dim, and infested with unwelcome creatures. The truth likely depended on workmanship, local conditions, and the writer's tolerance for dirt falling from above. A well-made sod home could be remarkably functional. A poor one could feel like living inside a disappointed garden. Labour divided along many lines, but almost everyone contributed to making a winter home more secure. Men often handled heavy cutting, digging, and hauling, though necessity easily blurred neat roles. Women plastered walls, patched cloth barriers, arranged bedding, managed stoves, stored food, and created order inside cramped quarters. Children gathered chips and kindling, carried water, stuffed cracks, and fetched tools. Frontier survival had little patience for people who announced that a task was beneath them. Cold air is a ruthless equalizer. The emotional importance of making a house tighter against the wind is hard to overstate. Every repaired seam offers relief out of proportion to its size. You knead mud into a crack or pin another blanket over a draft and immediately imagine the coming night as slightly less cruel. Shelter is not merely a structure, it becomes proof that your effort matters. In a place where weather can make you feel very small, these tiny acts of improvement restore a bit of control. Privacy, however, is in short supply. Many frontier homes shelter whole families in one room. Sleep, cooking, washing, mending, nursing sickness, and storing food all happen within the same modest space. The air grows close by evening, warm near the stove but cool toward the walls. Blankets may divide corners, yet every sound still carries. Someone snores, a child whimpers in sleep, a chair leg scrapes. The shared closeness can be comforting on bitter nights and maddening by morning. Winter encourages both affection and impatience. Storm preparation becomes almost ceremonial. Before bad weather, you check the roof, gather extra fuel, secure doors, bring in water, and make sure tools are where they can be found quickly. You glance repeatedly at the sky as if it might confess its plans. A storm does not care about your schedule, but routines make fear feel manageable. The body knows what to do even when the mind begins to worry. Close the shutter, brace the latch, pull the bedding farther from the wall, keep the lantern trimmed. Small actions, steady hands. Not all homes held up well. That too is part of the truth. Poor construction, rushed work, low funds, and plain bad luck could leave families in miserable quarters. Wind found openings, snow crept through gaps, roofs sagged, frozen mud, chinking, cracked and dropped out. Repairs often had to be made in weather so unpleasant that your hands lost feeling halfway through the job. Yet people kept fixing, patching, and reinforcing because the choice was simple. Improve the shelter or let the season move in as an extra resident. At night, once the fire settles and the room dims, you feel the success or failure of the day's work more clearly than ever. Does the bed near the wall feel less icy? Does the draught under the door still needle your feet? Does the roof hold steady under a rising gust? You listen and judge. The whole house becomes a kind of instrument, registering wind, snow, heat, and weakness. There is no pretending. The weather writes its review directly onto the walls. By winter's heart, you understand something the open country teaches very well. A home is not just where you live. It is a machine for holding off the season. It must trap warmth, block wind, manage smoke, protect food, and preserve a bit of peace in conditions that wear down the nerves. Every log, sod block, rag strip, and mud seam serves that purpose. The Old West often gets dressed up in romance, but winter strips things down to essentials. A good house is one that lets you wake with all your toes content to remain attached. So you keep building even after the building seems finished. You tighten, patch, brace, stuff, mend, listen, adjust. The wind returns every night to inspect your work, and you answer it not with speeches but with thicker walls, lower drafts, warmer corners, and stubborn hands that refuse to surrender the room. By the time deep winter settles over the frontier, heat becomes less of a comfort and more of a daily obsession. You wake thinking about it. You step outside measuring it in reverse, through what the air steals from your face. You sit indoors calculating how much of it still glows in the stove. Every task circles back to the same plain truth. Without fuel, the house is only a box where the cold can reach you more neatly. The search for warmth begins early each morning. You pull on stiff clothes in the dim light and feel the room bite at your skin. The ashes in the stove have gone grey. There may still be a hidden ember if luck is kind, and you kneel to coax it with careful breath, kindling, and a hopeful patience that feels almost devotional. If the fire's died completely, the whole process starts again from scratch. Your fingers fumble, your breath shows in front of you. The smell of old ash rises first, then dry splinters, then at last that sweet living scent of wood beginning to catch. A flame in winter is never just a flame. It is breakfast, morale, safety, dry socks, and the difference between a manageable morning and a miserable one. The frontier stove stands there like a blunt little monarch, deciding the mood of the whole room. When it draws well, everything seems possible. When it sulks and smokes, life takes on a very personal irritation. You can be strong of character and still resent a stubborn stove with surprising intensity. Wood is the ideal fuel in many parts of the West, but ideals and reality rarely travel in the same wagon. In mountain regions and wooded river valleys, timber may be available if you're willing to cut, haul, split, stack, and guard it from damp. On the open plains, where trees can be scarce and far apart, wood is often too precious to waste. Settlers might travel long distances to gather it from creek beds or purchase it at unwelcome prices if a town or rail line made that possible. A loaded wagon of firewood looked almost luxurious in winter, like a moving promise of civilized life. One widely accepted historical fact is that fuel shortages were among the most serious winter problems for homesteaders on the Great Plains. Settlers wrote again and again about the difficulty of securing enough burnable material in treeless country. Railroad companies and land promoters had praised rich farmland, but they were often quieter about the awkward detail that the prairie did not come with a generous stack of seasoned oak. You discover very quickly that owning land is one thing, heating yourself on it is another. So you adapt, because adaptation is what the frontier demands when reality turns impolite. Where timber is rare, you gather dried animal dung, often called buffalo chips in earlier decades and cow chips in settled ranching areas. The name sounds faintly comic to modern ears, which is unfair. These humble discs of dried grass and digested prairie could burn surprisingly well when fully cured by sun and wind. Children often helped collect them, carrying baskets or sacks across frozen ground. A chore like that strips away the last traces of romantic frontier fantasy rather efficiently. The smell of chip smoke is different from wood smoke. It is earthier, sharper, mixed with the scent of old grass and open range. At first you notice it constantly. Later it becomes part of the background of winter life, no stranger than lamp oil or wet wool. It clings to clothes, it hangs in your hair, it marks the inside of the house and the rhythm of supper. A person can get used to almost anything if the alternative is freezing. And the Old West proves that point over and over with relentless creativity. Fuel gathering is not one task, but many. You search for branches along a creek, you break apart old roots, you save scraps from building work, you collect chips from fields where cattle have grazed, you stack everything with care because dampness is the enemy of flame. A good pile of fuel is one of the most reassuring sights on a winter day. A poor pile has a way of staring back at you accusingly. You count the stack in your head the way a banker counts coins, always wondering whether it will last. The physical labor involved is easy to underestimate from a warm room. Cutting wood is loud, repetitive work that shakes the arms and shoulders. The axe handle grows slick with sweat even in bitter air. Your breath deepens. The blade bites, sticks, frees, and bites again. Logs have to be split to fit the stove. Larger pieces must be hauled. Smaller pieces need sorting. Splinters find your palms. Frozen ground jars your boots. By the end, the scent of fresh split wood is clean and almost sweet, but your back reminds you exactly what that fragrance cost. Even fuel that seems free is not truly free. Buffalo chips do not gather themselves. Wood from a distant creek does not walk home. Time spent chasing heat is time not spent mending harness, tending stock, or resting. Frontier winter turns energy into a cruel little puzzle. You must burn effort to secure fuel, then burn fuel to recover from the effort. There is something almost philosophical about it. If your fingers are warm enough to contemplate philosophy, children often became experts in the economy of warmth. They learned how many chips fit into a basket, how dry kindling should sound when snapped, and which corner near the stove was worth competing for. They also learned to avoid waste. A door left open too long brought immediate protest. Wet mittens placed badly could steam without drying. A stick burned carelessly might be scolded over like an insult to the family treasury. Winter made conservation feel moral. Heat squandered was not just inconvenience. It was failure. You also begin to understand your stove with the intimacy normally reserved for difficult relatives. Some frontier families had cast iron stoves bought through stores or catalogues, while others relied on simpler heating arrangements, depending on place, means, and date. A cast iron stove could be a marvel, heating a room, warming irons, drying clothes, and cooking meals all at once. It could also crack, warp, smoke, or consume fuel at a rate that made your eyes narrow in suspicion. You feed it and judge it constantly. It returns the favor with moods. At night, the stove takes command of the room. Boots line up nearby, steaming faintly. Damp gloves give off a sour wet smell as they dry. A kettle whispers on the lid. The iron surface ticks softly as it expands and contracts. The air closest to the stove grows almost too warm, while the far corners remain cool and watchful. One side of your body may roast while the other still remembers the yard. Frontier comfort is often very unevenly distributed. A quirky detail from many frontier households is how creative people became with preserving precious coals, rather than waste matches or struggle each morning to start from nothing. Some families banked the fire at night under ashes or saved live coals carefully for dawn. In some places, neighbours might even borrow embers from one another if a fire went out entirely. Imagine knocking at a door in freezing weather not for sugar or gossip, but for a glowing fragment of survival carried home in a shovel or metal pan. That is community at its hottest. Historians still disagree on how efficient many frontier stoves truly were in daily use, partly because surviving accounts come from different climates, decades, and household incomes. Some memoirs praise a beloved stove as if it were a family hero. Others describe miserable contraptions that smoked, cracked lids, and left half the room cold. The truth likely depended on fuel quality, room size, installation, and whether the owner had enough patience to negotiate with cast iron before breakfast. The emotional pull of firelight grows stronger as winter deepens. The glow on a wall can soothe you in a way no fine furniture ever could. You watch flames through the stove door or the gaps in a firebox and feel your body relax by degrees. There is the low murmur of burning fuel, the gentle, shifting collapse of embers, the faint metallic ping from heating iron. These sounds become part of evening itself. Without them, the room feels unfinished, almost abandoned. Scarcity sharpens every decision. Do you burn more fuel now and risk having less later? Do you keep the house warmer for comfort or cooler for economy? Do you use extra heat to dry a load of washing indoors? Can you spare enough fire for baking bread today? Small domestic choices become strategic ones. You do not merely keep house. You manage resources under pressure, with weather as an auditor who never stops checking the books. Outside, the search for fuel leaves marks across the landscape. Wagon ruts deepen along paths to timber or brush. Fields get picked over for chips. Brush piles shrink. Nearby creek bottoms grow more bare. In settled districts, competition for wood could become sharp, especially where population grew faster than local supply. A person who owned access to timber possessed something more valuable than scenery. In winter, a stand of cottonwood could look like a savings account with bark. Of course, desperation could push people toward burning almost anything remotely combustible. Corn cobs, twisted hay, broken tools past repair, old fencing, even dried weeds might be fed into a hungry stove in lean times. The frontier had little respect for pure categories. A thing was not truly useless if it could still provide 10 minutes of heat. You begin to look at every object with a quiet secondary question. Could you burn it if things turned worse? Cooking and heating compete for the same precious resources, which adds another layer of strain. A pot of beans simmering for hours smells wonderful, but it demands fuel. Bread requires an oven hot enough to matter. Coffee, if you have it, becomes almost ceremonial because it costs warmth as well as supplies. The room fills with scents that feel both homey and tactical: salt pork frying, onions softening, flour browning, smoke curling into everything. Supper is not only nourishment, it is proof that the fire has been made to serve more than one purpose. Your body learns the geography of warmth with astonishing precision. You know exactly how close to stand to the stove before your shins grow painfully hot. You know where to hang socks so they dry without scorching. You know which blankets should be warmed before bed, and which boots must not be left too close overnight. The touch of warmed fabric against chilled skin can feel almost luxurious. Not grand, not elegant, just blessedly warm. There is also fear hidden inside fuel worries. A blizzard is one thing with a stocked woodpile. It becomes another entirely when supplies are low. Wind outside sounds harsher when you know the stack is shrinking. Each armful brought in feels lighter than it should. You start doing little calculations while trying not to alarm anyone else in the room. How many days if the storm lasts? How many nights if the temperature falls again? How much can be spared for a morning? This is how winter enters the mind, not only through cold but through counting. Yet people became remarkably inventive under that pressure. They built better stacks to keep wood dry. They mixed fuels according to what burned longest. They learned to close off unused parts of a room, to bank fires carefully, and to time chores around periods of warmth. Survival was rarely glamorous, but it was full of practical intelligence. The Old West rewarded people who observed, adjusted, and refused to waste small advantages. By evening, with darkness pressing at the windows and the stove glowing steadily at last, the whole day seems to gather around that heat. Your clothes smell of smoke and frost. Your hands are rough from hauling. The floor near the door still carries a trace of snowmelt and dirt. Somewhere outside, the wind moves over empty ground. Inside, there is light, a little warmth, and the deep satisfaction of having secured one more day's defense against the cold. That satisfaction never becomes casual. Heat is too hard won for that. You respect every ember, every chip, every split log, every careful layer of ash laid over coals for the night. The frontier teaches you that fire is not merely a household convenience. It is labor made visible, hope made practical, and winter held back for a few more precious hours. By midwinter, the table becomes a place of arithmetic. You sit down to eat, but part of your mind is always counting. How much flour remains? how much salt pork is left in the barrel, whether the beans need stretching with cornmeal, whether the coffee can be made weak enough to last and still pass for coffee. Hunger on the frontier is rarely theatrical at first. It begins as careful reduction, then turns into habit, and only later reveals how much the body notices every missing comfort. The room smells of smoke, grease, and whatever is simmering in the pot. That smell can be reassuring even when the meal itself is plain. A kettle of beans gives off a soft, earthy steam. Salt pork spits in the pan with a scent both rich and blunt. Biscuits, if there are biscuits, fill the house with a warm, floury smell that feels almost luxurious. You stand near the stove longer than necessary, drawn by the heat and the promise of supper. The body listens closely to kitchen sounds in winter. A lid rattling on a pot can feel like hope. Food on the Old West frontier was deeply shaped by distance and season. Fresh produce might vanish for long stretches. Roads could become difficult or impossible. Hunting was uncertain. Supply trips required time, weather, animals, and cash, all of which were often in short supply. So winter meals leaned heavily on durable things: beans, flour, cornmeal, salt pork, bacon, dried fruit if you were lucky, potatoes if the cellar held, molasses, rice in some places, coffee if money and supply lines allowed it. The menu was not designed for excitement. It was designed for endurance. One solid historical fact appears again and again in settler accounts. Flour was a prized staple across much of the frontier, and when supplies ran low, households became very careful about every cup. Flour meant bread, biscuits, gravy thickener, dumplings, pie crust on rare, cheerful days, and a sense that meals still resembled meals. A dwindling flour sack could change the whole emotional weather of a household. You may tell yourself that beans are hearty and perfectly respectable, but a frontier winter without bread feels much longer. The touch of the season reaches the food itself. Butter, if you have any, turns hard and stubborn in the cold. Dough rises slowly, if at all, in a chilly room. A tin plate cools quickly once food is served. You cup a bowl in both hands to feel its warmth seep into your palms before you even take the first bite. That warmth matters. Hot food can lift spirits out of proportion to its ingredients. A plain stew eaten steaming feels generous. The same stew eaten lukewarm feels like punishment from a very unimaginative universe. Breakfast often aims at necessity rather than delight. You may have biscuits left from the day before, perhaps fried pork, maybe mush made from cornmeal, maybe beans reheated because waste is not a luxury the season permits. Coffee, if present, arrives like a moral support companion. It may be bitter, thin, or loaded with chicory or other stretching ingredients. You drink it anyway. Frontier coffee had a duty beyond taste. It put heat inside the body and gave adults something to cling to before dawn chores. That alone made it nearly sacred. Dinner and supper do not always look dramatically different. A pot can stay on the stove for hours, taking additions as the day goes on. Beans meet bits of pork, potatoes go in if there are potatoes, onion if fortune smiles. A little dried apple might appear in a separate dish if someone has planned carefully. The practical kitchen becomes a place of constant adjustment. You taste, stir, add water, ration fat, and consider whether the stew should become thicker or merely appear thicker. The frontier could turn anyone into an expert in making modest meals seem intentional. Salt pork deserves its own severe little paragraph. It was common, durable, salty enough to wake the dead, and useful in many households across the 19th century American frontier, fried on its own, cut into beans, rendered for grease, or worked into other dishes. It offered fat and flavour when fresh meat was scarce. It also carried a certain emotional fatigue. After enough winter meals, you begin to feel that salt pork has become not merely a food, but a personality in the house. A persistent one. Reliable. Yes. Charming. No. The tableware tells its own story. Tin cups, heavy spoons, thick crockery if any survived the journey, knives worn to ordinary usefulness. A table may be a real table, a rough plank on supports, or a box drafted into higher service. The surface might smell faintly of soap, wood, lamp oil, and flour dust. Hands rest on it cracked from cold and dishwater. Sleeves carry traces of smoke. Elbows stay tucked because space is limited. The room is small, the portions controlled, and still the meal gathers people in with a gravity stronger than decoration. Children experience winter meals with a blend of gratitude and impatience. They are hungry often, and growing bodies do not care much for adult speeches about economy. A child can stare at the pot as if willing it to produce more. A crust of bread may vanish very quickly. Molasses on cornbread can feel like a holiday. Dried apples become tiny treasures. Adults notice all of this, of course, which is why many pioneer recollections remember mothers and grandmothers quietly giving away the best bits while insisting they were not hungry. Frontier love is frequently expressed through unequal portions. A quirky tidbit from the period is how inventive people became with substitutes when familiar ingredients ran low. Roasted grain or chicory might stand in for coffee. Syrup could replace more expensive sweeteners. Dried pumpkin or squash might be worked into pies or puddings where fruit was scarce. Frontier households were deeply practical about imitation. If something looked enough like a proper dish in dim lamplight and eased the mood at supper, it had done its job. Authenticity is a luxury concept. Warm calories are much more persuasive. Not every family faced the same level of scarcity. Ranchers, town merchants, soldiers at posts, miners, indigenous communities, railroad workers, and isolated homesteaders all met winter with different resources and different risks. Some could buy supplies, some bartered, some hunted or trapped effectively. Some lived near trade routes. Others were left to calculate every meal against weather and distance. The phrase Old West covers a vast and uneven reality, and winter sharpened those inequalities with painful clarity. Two households may live under the same sky and eat very different suppers. Game could help when available, though success was far from guaranteed. Rabbits, deer, antelope, prairie chickens, and other local animals might supplement the winter table depending on region, skill, law, and luck. The smell of fresh meat in the pan could transform the mood of an entire house. Yet hunting in winter took time and energy, and poor weather could make it dangerous or futile. Even a good hunter could return empty-handed. The frontier has no obligation to reward effort on schedule, which is one reason it appears so often in memoirs as both teacher and nuisance. Food storage was a constant challenge. Flour had to stay dry. Pork needed guarding from spoilage and pests. Potatoes might freeze or rot depending on cellar conditions. Mice considered every pantry a public invitation. You learn to listen for them at night, rustling with shameless confidence. A lidded crock becomes precious. A cool corner is judged carefully. The pantry, if there is a pantry, smells of grain, earth, salt, and caution. Open a barrel and you breathe in the sharp mineral scent of brine, or the dusty reassurance of meal. Close it fast. Waste has many little pores. Historians still argue over how varied frontier diets truly were from place to place, because memoirs, store ledgers, military records, and later family stories do not always align neatly. Some accounts emphasize relentless monotony. Others suggest a surprising adaptability, especially where trade networks or local food knowledge improved options. The truth likely shifts with region, class, season, and memory. People often remember either the hardest meals or the happiest ones, while the long middle stretch of ordinary beans can disappear into silence. The social meaning of meals grows stronger in winter because the meal is never just about food, it is warmth, pause, companionship, and a small temporary victory over the season. Lamps turn the room amber, steam rises from bowls. Someone passes a plate. Someone sighs before eating, not dramatically, just tired in the bones. Conversation may be sparse. The crackle of the stove fills the gaps. You hear spoons against crockery, a chair creak, the wind pushing faintly at the outer wall. The simplest supper can feel ceremonial when darkness surrounds the house so completely. There is, of course, a psychological difference between being fed and being satisfied. Frontier winters often provided the first without much of the second. Meals could keep you alive while still leaving you thinking fondly of fruit, fresh milk, green vegetables, soft bread, butter that spreads, or meat that does not taste of salt and storage. Cravings become vivid in cold weather. You remember summer food with unreasonable tenderness. A single onion, sliced into a pot, can perfume the room like a grand event. A little sugar can improve temper so quickly it almost seems medicinal. Women in many frontier households carried the hidden burden of transforming limited supplies into morale. That meant baking when fuel was available, stretching leftovers, planning around scarcity, and presenting plain food with steadiness rather than alarm. Men might speak of hard work in the field or on the range, and rightly so. But the kitchen was its own site of strategy. To keep a family fed through a long winter required foresight, improvisation, and nerves. It also required serving the same ingredients in enough different forms that people did not stage a small emotional rebellion against beans. Even the act of eating is shaped by cold. You chew faster because hot food cools quickly. You keep a sleeve clear of the table because there is not much room. Your feet search unconsciously for the warmest spot on the floor. The bowl warms your fingers. The spoon is hot for a moment, then not. Your face feels flushed near the stove while your back remains cool. The body lives in layers of temperature, and supper is one of the few times those layers briefly soften. On especially lean days, the table can expose every household feeling at once. Pride resists complaint. Children sense tension anyway. Adults pretend portions are perfectly adequate. Someone makes a small joke. Someone is too tired to laugh. Hunger need not become famine to leave a mark on the mood. Thin meals, thin patience. A poor harvest, a delayed wagon, a spoiled barrel, or a sick animal can echo through weeks of suppers. Winter has a talent for turning one practical setback into many smaller private sorrows, and yet people found ways to mark pleasure when they could. A pie from dried apples, molasses cookies if ingredients allowed, pancakes, fresh biscuits on a very cold evening. A little preserved fruit opened when spirits needed lifting. The scent of baking could make a frontier house feel transformed for an hour, less like a fort against weather, and more like a home in the fullest sense. You remember those meals very clearly, not because they were grand, but because they interrupted hardship with sweetness, warmth, and the dangerous idea that life might still include treats. By the time bowls are scraped and cups emptied, the table holds the evidence of another day managed successfully. Not lavishly, not effortlessly, successfully. Crumbs matter, drippings matter. What remains in the sack and barrel matters. Winter eating in the Old West is a lesson in plainness, discipline, and gratitude sharpened by necessity. You sit, chew, swallow, and plan, knowing that tomorrow's comfort depends partly on what you chose not to consume tonight. That is the quiet truth of the winter table. It offers heat, routine, and enough nourishment to keep the body moving, but it also reminds you how fragile comfort can be. Every bean, every spoonful of flour, every strip of pork carries weight beyond its size. On the frontier, supper is never just supper. It is inventory made edible. Winter first touches your skin through cloth, before the wind reaches the bones, before the stove fails to keep up, before the water bucket freezes solid. There is the simple matter of what stands between your body and the cold. On the frontier, that barrier is rarely elegant. It scratches, bunches, pinches, stiffens, and smells faintly of smoke, sweat, leather, and old weather. You dress not to look impressive, but to remain functional, which is a much less poetic ambition and far more urgent at sunrise. The day begins with fabric that feels half awake. Your shirt is cold when it slides over your shoulders. Your stockings resist your hands. Wool long johns cling with a rough, stubborn grip. You tug on layer after layer while the room still holds the last chill of night, and every garment seems to remind you that comfort is negotiable. Buttons are clumsy in numb fingers. Ties refuse to behave. A sleeve catches. A seam rubs. Winter dressing is not one graceful act. It is a series of small arguments between the body and the clothes meant to save it. You learn quickly that one layer is a hope, two are a plan, and three may still be inadequate when the wind rises. Men, women, and children across the Old West relied heavily on wool when they could get it, because wool kept warmth better than many other common fabrics, and remained useful even when damp. Flannel shirts, petticoats, wool skirts, knitted stockings, scarves, mittens, shawls, and blankets all joined the campaign. Cotton had its place, especially next to the skin, but when the temperature fell hard, wool was the trusted old soldier of the wardrobe. It was itchy. Yes, reliable too. Frontier affection often sounds a lot like resignation. One mainstream historical fact appears in many records from the 19th century West. Clothing was expensive and labor-intensive, so most households owned fewer garments than modern people would consider normal. That meant winter clothes were worn hard, patched often, handed down repeatedly, and expected to survive conditions that were not exactly gentle. A coat might serve for years. Boots might be resoled more than once. A child's sweater might begin life on an older sibling and end it as a collection of useful scraps. Fashion on the frontier had a practical memory. It remembered every previous owner. The smell of winter clothing settles into the whole house. Damp wool drying by the stove has a warm animal scent, earthy and thick. Leather gives off a sharper smell when thawing. Fur, when present, carries a faint musk beneath smoke and frost. Mittens dropped near the hearth release the odour of wet snow, skin, and old yarn. You may not notice it much after a while. Visitors certainly would. Frontier air inside a winter dwelling is a complicated mixture, and laundry soap has only so much authority over it. Outerwear becomes a matter of strategy. A heavy coat can save the day outside and burden you indoors. Too many layers while chopping wood leave you sweating, which is dangerous once you stop moving. Too few while hauling water invite a chill that follows you back inside and settles between your shoulders like bad news. So you learn the strange art of frontier temperature management. Scarf off for the hard work. Scarf back on for the walk to the barn. Gloves tucked into a belt when fingers need freedom. Hat pulled lower when the wind turns mean. Dressing well means adjusting constantly. Hats matter more than vanity allows you to admit. A felt hat, wool cap, fur cap, bonnet, or wrapped kerchief can mean the difference between manageable cold and a headache that makes the whole morning feel hostile. Ears suffer quickly. Foreheads ache. Hair gathers frost at the edges. Women often layered bonnets with hoods or shawls. Men added caps or wrapped cloth where they could. Children, of course, had a mysterious gift for losing whatever kept them warm, often with astonishing speed. Somewhere on the frontier lies an invisible museum of vanished mittens. Footwear is its own battle. Boots must handle mud, ice, frozen ground, manure, snowmelt, and long days of work, all without becoming unbearable. Leather boots were common, but leather alone is not magic. It stiffens in the cold. It leaks if poorly cared for. Wet boots can turn from useful gear into an intimate form of punishment. People stuffed footwear with dry grass, rags, or extra layers when needed. Thick socks were precious. So were dry socks, which are not always the same thing. There are few pleasures more profound than changing into warm, dry stockings after a freezing chore. The touch of cold leather against your feet in the morning can be shocking. You slip into boots that feel like they belong to an unkind stranger. The soles are hard, the uppers resist. Laces or fastenings behave as though winter has made them philosophical opponents of your schedule. Then, once your feet begin to warm the interior, the boots soften slightly and become companions again. Frontier life is full of objects that start the day as enemies and end it as allies. Women's winter clothing on the frontier required endurance that often gets overlooked. Long skirts could collect snow, mud, and burrs. Petticoats added warmth but also bulk. Shawls helped, yet could slip while chores still needed doing. Gloves might be too thin for real protection, or too awkward for fine tasks. A woman milking, cooking, washing, mending, hauling, and tending children had to dress for labour, not merely for appearance, but cultural expectations did not vanish just because the weather was rude. Many women found practical compromises, shortening hems for work, layering heavily, or sewing garments that borrowed usefulness from menswear while still looking acceptably feminine by local standards. Men had no monopoly on discomfort either. Trousers grew stiff, Suspenders bit into the shoulders under multiple layers. Coats limited movement while soaring or lifting. Beards collected frost in some regions, giving a person the distinguished look of a mildly annoyed snowdrift. Gloves suitable for warmth often reduced dexterity to something close to puppet hands. Remove them, and metal tools burn with cold. Keep them on, and buttons, buckles, and harness straps become a test of patience. Winter loves making every solution imperfect. Children wore whatever could be spared, altered, or produced at home. This often meant layers that were functional but uneven, with sleeves too long, coats too short, stockings sagging, and scarves wrapped 3 times because a proper fit was a luxury. The sight could be endearing from a distance. Up close it was simply practical. A child's body loses heat quickly, and frontier families knew it. Little ones might be bundled until they resembled determined laundry. Movements suffered, but at least the wind had to work harder to find the skin. A quirky tidbit from frontier life is that newspaper could serve as emergency insulation inside clothing or boots. Tucked under a coat or wrapped around feet, it offered a bit of extra barrier against the cold. It rustled, shifted, and probably did not flatter anyone's silhouette. But winter is rarely impressed by silhouettes. A person padded with yesterday's headlines may not look heroic, yet such improvisation captures the frontier spirit better than any polished portrait. Laundry in winter deserves deep sympathy. Washing clothes in freezing weather is a slow conflict involving cold water, steaming kettle, raw hands, and the maddening question of how to dry anything before it turns rigid. Wet garments near the stove drip and smell. Hung outside, they can freeze into sculptural forms that appear ready to walk off on their own. The touch of half-dried wool is especially memorable, clammy in one place, scorching in another if turned too close to the heat. Clean clothes are possible. Conveniently clean clothes are less common. Because garments were so valuable, mending became a constant part of winter life. Needles flashed in lamplight, elbows were patched, knees reinforced, socks darned, linings replaced, buttons scavenged from older clothing and given a second career. A tear was not a minor flaw. It was a direct invitation to cold air. You sew because the family needs warmth, not because sewing is charmingly domestic. The sound of thread pulled through fabric can be as important to survival as the sound of the wood going into the stove. Historians still debate how quickly commercially made clothing reached remote Western households in large numbers, because access varied enormously by region, year, income, and transport routes. Some families near towns, forts, or railroad lines could buy factory-made garments, boots, and blankets more readily. Others remained dependent on home sewing, local cobblers, trade, or second-hand goods for much longer. The result is a winter wardrobe landscape full of uneven mixtures. Store-bought coat, home-knitted scarf, repaired army blanket, borrowed fur gloves. Nothing matches neatly except the need. Animal skins and fur entered many winter wardrobes in practical ways. Buffalo robes had earlier been prized across much of the plains. Sheepskin coats, fur caps, lined gloves, and hide moccasins or overshoes appeared depending on region and background. Fur-trimmed cuffs and collars were not just decorative flourishes in harsh weather. They trapped warmth where the body lost it fastest. The feel of fur against your neck or wrist could be wonderfully soft after hours in coarse wool. It also collected snow and smell, because every comfort on the frontier comes with a little paperwork attached. Some people adapted clothing traditions from indigenous neighbours, military surplus, immigrant custom, or local craft. Moccasins with extra wrappings, leggings, wool trade blankets, or specific methods of layering could all make practical sense in the right environment. Settlers did not invent winter wisdom from nothing. They learned, borrowed, altered, and sometimes failed to acknowledge the sources of what worked. Cold has a way of dissolving pride in private, even if public stories later pretend otherwise. The body beneath all these layers is never entirely at ease. Too much bundling indoors leaves you overheated while your feet remain cold. A draft at the neck can make the whole outfit feel useless. Snow slipping into a boot can ruin the next hour. A mitten dropped in slush becomes a household problem. Wool at the throat scratches. Seams rub under the arms. Clothes take on the shape of labour, stiff at the knees, shiny at the elbows, darkened where grease and handling have done their work. Yet the very wornness of these garments can be oddly reassuring. A coat moulded to your shoulders feels known. A shawl soft from years of use can calm you the instant it settles around the back. There is social meaning in winter clothing too. A good overcoat, sturdy boots, or a fine wool shawl may hint at relative prosperity. Thin layers, poor repairs, or ill-fitting hand-me-downs can reveal hardship without a word being spoken. People notice, even when politeness advises silence. On the frontier, where lives a visible and practical realities hard to hide, clothing announces much about means, luck, and domestic skill. A carefully patched sleeve may say more about a household than any speech ever could. Even bedtime carries its own dress code. You may sleep in nightclothes, undergarments, or additional layers depending on the house and the severity of the weather. Some people warmed garments by the stove before climbing into them at dawn. Others tucked tomorrow's clothes into bed to steal a little body heat overnight. The sheets, if there are sheets, feel cold at first touch. Blankets smell faintly of lanolin, smoke, and the day just lived. You burrow in, wrapped not only in fabric but in strategy, already planning how to face the cold again in the morning. By now, you no longer think of clothing as a matter of style. It is shelter you carry on your body. It protects the wrists where the wind sneaks in, the throat where breath chills, the feet that must keep working, and the hands that never seem fully warm from December to thaw. A coat, a scarf, a pair of patched socks, a lined glove, a skirt hemmed for work, a hat pulled low over aching ears. These are not accessories. They are small fortresses stitched together from wool, leather, thread, and stubborn experience. That is what winter dress really means in the Old West. It is not a picture book arrangement of handsome coats and dramatic snow. It is the daily compromise between what you need, what you own, what you can repair, and what your body can bear. The clothes rarely fit perfectly, never feel luxurious for long, and almost always ask something of you. But they stand there, layer upon layer, between your skin and a season that would happily take more than you can spare. Sooner or later, the sky stops looking like weather and starts looking like intention. The light turns strange over the plains, pale in one direction and bruised in another. The air sharpens until each breath feels narrower than the last. Snow does not always arrive with dramatic warning. Sometimes it comes quietly at first, fine grains skimming over the ground like sifted flour. Then the wind rises, the horizon fades, and the whole world begins erasing itself in front of your eyes. A blizzard in the Old West is not merely snow. It is wind, cold, confusion, sound, and distance all altered at once. The land that looked open and knowable in fair weather suddenly becomes treacherous. Familiar fences vanish. A nearby shed seems to slide farther away. The path between house and barn, walked 100 times, becomes a guess rather than a fact. You stand at the door, squinting into white motion, and realize that the prairie has developed opinions about whether you should continue your plans. The first sensation is often sound. Wind rattles at the walls, pushes against the roof, and forces itself into cracks with a thin whining note. Outside, it roars across the open country with a steadiness that feels almost mechanical. Snow taps the window, then lashes it, then turns into a moving veil so dense that the glass seems coated from the outside by living static. When you open the door even a little, the storm enters instantly, carrying icy air and tiny hard pellets that sting the face. The house itself reacts. Boards complain, hinges strain. The latch feels more important than ever. One widely recognized historical reality of life in the Great Plains and surrounding western regions is that blizzards were among the deadliest winter threats, especially in open country where landmarks were few and wind had room to build. People could become lost a short distance from home, even on land they knew well. Accounts from settlers, ranchers, and railroad communities repeat the same terrible pattern. A person goes out for stock, fuel, water, or a nearby building, and then simply loses direction in the whiteout. The distances sound absurd afterward. 50 yards, 100, far enough, The white itself has many forms. Fresh snow can drift soft and dry around your boots. Wind-packed snow hits more like sand. It slips down collars, needles the cheeks, and gathers in cuffs where it melts into cold dampness that stays with you. Soon your scarf stiffens. Your eyelashes gather frost. Breath freezes around the mouth and nose. Gloves pick up a crust. The skin along your face feels both numb and raw, which is an especially insulting combination. Winter does enjoy a layered approach to discomfort. Visibility goes first, and with it goes confidence. You look toward a fence line and see only fragments. Posts appear, vanish, appear again. A wagon track that seemed obvious in the morning is now swallowed by drift. The sky and ground merge into one bright grey field without edge or depth. This effect, sometimes called a whiteout, strips the landscape of normal clues. Your eyes search for shape and distance and find almost none. It is like walking inside a blank page while the wind tries to push you off the margin. Inside the house, everyone behaves differently during a storm. Some grow quiet, some become brisk and practical. Children might feel a flicker of excitement until the force of the weather makes clear that this is not play. Adults check doors, windows, stock, fuel, and the path to any necessary outbuilding. Wet things are brought in. Extra wood or chips are stacked close. Water buckets are filled if possible. The stove becomes the center of command. Its heat and steadiness almost moral in a storm. You keep glancing at it, reassured that something in the room still obeys known rules. Blizzards also alter time. The day seems to narrow. Morning darkens early. Afternoon looks like dusk. A few hours of storm can feel like a full separate world, sealed off from the rest of the season. If the wind continues through night, sleep becomes shallow and interrupted. You wake to a change in sound, wondering whether that new thump is drifted snow against the wall or something worse. You imagine the roof, burdened under weight, the animals turned away from the gale, the path outside already lost. Rest becomes another task performed imperfectly. A quirky detail from many frontier recollections is the use of guide ropes between buildings in storm-prone country. Some families ran ropes or lines from house to barn or other essential structures so they could feel their way through blinding snow. It sounds dramatic until you imagine the alternative. In ordinary weather, the rope might hang there looking almost foolish. In a blizzard, it becomes one of the smartest objects on the property. Survival often does look a little silly right up until it proves itself. Wind is the true tyrant of the storm. Snow alone can be inconvenient, even beautiful. Wind weaponizes it. It sweeps powder into the air, packs it against doors, sculpts it into ridges, and drives it into every weak point in your clothing and walls. It strips heat from the body with astonishing speed. A calm, cold day is one thing. The same temperature with hard wind becomes a different creature entirely. You learn to respect the wind not because it is dramatic, but because it changes every other danger into a worse version of itself. Outbuildings and livestock turn a blizzard from an indoor endurance test into an outdoor necessity. Animals still need water, feed, and checking. Horses may drift with their backs turned to the storm, manes crusted with ice. Cattle bunch together, their bodies steaming faintly where snow meets warmth. Chickens become deeply offended by winter in a way that almost earns sympathy. If you must cross the yard, each step is work. Drifts grab at your legs. The world beyond your own arm feels uncertain. You move bent forward, eyes narrowed, using fences, walls, or rope as proof that direction still exists. The smell of a storm day indoors is distinct. Wet wool drying near the stove, smoke pressed low by the weather, melted snow darkening boots on the floor, hot metal, lamp oil, and something cooking slowly because everyone is trapped close to the heat. There is comfort in these smells, but also a little tension. They tell you the house is sealed and crowded against the weather, doing its best to remain a proper human space while the storm scratches and pounds outside. Stories from the frontier often include the grim fact that experienced people could still make fatal errors in a blizzard. Historians have long noted that familiarity with local land did not guarantee safety once landmarks vanished. A person might angle slightly wrong into the wind, circle without realizing it, or pass within sight of shelter and never know. This is one reason blizzards occupy such a grim place in Western memory. They punish not only ignorance but also confidence. Perhaps especially confidence. There is also the problem of drifting snow, which behaves less like a blanket and more like architecture. It piles against doors until they will not open inward. It buries low fences. It presses around sheds and under eaves. A house can wake to find itself partly walled in by shapes the wind built overnight. Digging out becomes a task of both labour and geometry. Where is the actual threshold? Where did the path used to be? Is that drift hollow or solid? Snow on the plains is never content merely to fall. It wants to rearrange the property. Children remember blizzards vividly for obvious reasons. The window turns white. The world disappears. Adults speak in tighter voices. The usual outdoor boundaries vanish into something mysterious and forbidden. Yet even for children, wonder does not last long when the cold begins creeping around the door and the grown-ups keep checking the stove. In some recollections, children are made to sit close, stay bundled, and remain very quiet while adults listen for changing weather or plan the next necessary trip outside. Stillness itself becomes part of the household response. Sometimes the worst part is not the height of the storm but the hours after, when the wind eases enough to reveal what changed. Fences may be buried or broken. Paths have vanished. Stock may have wandered, drifted, or become trapped behind snowbanks. Sheds need reaching. Water sources may be iced over or inaccessible. The sky clears with an almost offensive innocence, blue and calm above all the trouble left behind. The storm seems to have departed without the slightest sense of responsibility. Scholars still disagree on how often later frontier stories exaggerated blizzard drama for memory and local legend. Because storms became moral tales as well as weather events. Some memoirs certainly heightened suspense, condensing fear and survival into neater scenes than real life usually provides. Even so, meteorological records, newspaper reports, and death counts leave no doubt that severe blizzards repeatedly caused real devastation across Western settlements. The embroidery may vary. The cold facts do not. A blizzard also changes human judgment in subtler ways. Hunger feels sharper. Irritation rises faster. A creaking shutter can sound like a crisis. A delay of 1 hour in feeding stock feels enormous when each trip outside costs so much effort. Inside, people may pace, sit, rise again, check the same window twice, and listen for changes that are difficult to describe. There is a helplessness to storm waiting that frontier culture did not particularly admire, yet everyone knew it. Sometimes you cannot conquer the weather. You can only prepare, endure, and avoid adding your own mistakes to its work. When travel is absolutely necessary, you dress with a kind of defensive concentration. Scarf higher, coat tighter, gloves secure, hat low, rope in hand if there is one. You open the door and the cold strikes instantly, stealing the breath for half a second. Snow swirls upward from the ground as though the earth itself has decided to become weather. Your boots sink, slide, and lift heavily. The barn should be close. It is close. Yet for a few moments it seems to exist in another country. The emotional effect of surviving repeated blizzards is difficult to miss. The land grows less innocent in your eyes. You still see beauty and snow under morning light or a moonlight on drifts, but you do not confuse beauty with kindness. A clear horizon can become a trap within hours. A mild day can shift by evening. Frontier winter teaches suspicion toward pleasant appearances. That lesson, once learned, stays in the body. You read the sky differently after a true storm. You feel pressure in your thoughts before you feel it in your ears. And still, people adjusted. They built windbreaks where possible, set guidelines, checked weather signs obsessively, kept fuel inside reach, and timed chores to avoid being caught far from shelter. They learned which clouds deserved respect and which winds meant trouble. Ranchers, teamsters, settlers, and railroad workers all developed local habits for storm country, because those who did not adapt remained vulnerable in ways the plains punished bluntly. Survival depended on reducing chance wherever human effort could reduce it. By the time the storm finally loosens its grip, the house feels almost tender in comparison. The floor under your boots is firm and known. The air, though smoky, is warm enough. The kettle mutters. Someone shakes snow from a coat near the door. Faces sting as circulation returns. Outside, drifts lean against the walls and the yard has been remade into humps, ridges, and hidden hazards. Inside, light reaches across the room in a calmer pattern again. No grand speech is needed. Everyone understands what has been held back. That is what a blizzard really is in the Old West. Not a picturesque snowfall, not a festive inconvenience, but a force that can erase distance, distort judgment, and turn familiar ground into danger with shocking speed. You do not defeat it in any glorious sense. You prepare, endure, and remain wary. You grip the rope, you trust the wall at your shoulder, you move slowly, you keep the stove alive, and when the white fury finally passes, you count what is still standing and give thanks for every ordinary thing the storm failed to take. Winter does not slow the work. That is one of its least charming qualities. You might imagine a season of stillness, a long quiet pause while snow settles over the range and everyone sensibly stays near the fire. The Old West laughs gently at that thought and hands you a bucket. Animals still need feeding, water still needs carrying, tools still break, fences still lean, roofs still leak. Cold weather does not cancel chores. It simply makes every one of them harder, earlier, wetter, heavier, and somehow more insulting. You wake before daylight because the work begins before the sky is willing to help. The room is dim, the stove impatient, and the air sharp enough to make climbing from bed feel like a personal betrayal. Your feet search for boots that are not exactly warm, only less terrible than the floor. Somewhere outside, a horse shifts, a cow gives a low sound from the dark. The day's already waiting, and it has no interest in your opinion. You pull on layers, swallow something hot if possible, and move toward the door while the house still smells of ashes and sleep. The first task is often the fire because no one wants to face the yard half frozen already. Then comes water. Water in winter becomes a full-time nuisance dressed as a necessity. A bucket skins over with ice. A barrel needs breaking open. A pump handle burns the palm with cold. If the nearest source is a creek, spring, or well at any distance, the trip must be made whether the morning is pleasant or vicious. The sound of ice cracking under a dipper becomes oddly familiar, a brittle little note that means the day has officially begun. One plain historical truth runs through frontier records from ranches, farms, military posts, and homesteads alike. Winter labor centered heavily on livestock, horses, mules, oxen, cows, chickens, sheep, and pigs did not disappear just because the temperature fell. Yeah, they had to be watered, fed, sheltered as best conditions allowed, and watched for sickness or injury. In many Western households, and the animals were transport, labor, food supply, investment, and future security all at once. Letting them suffer could ruin the year. So you go out even when the wind says you should not. The barn, if you are fortunate enough to have a proper one, smells like a whole different universe from the frozen yard. Hay, manure, leather, animal heat, old wood, damp straw, and warm breath all gather into a dense earthy comfort. The cold follows you in, but it loses some of its arrogance there. Horses turn their heads as you enter, their breath ghosts in the air, cattle shift heavily. Chickens mutter with deep personal offense. The sounds are soft and practical. Snorts, hooves scraping, wings rustling, feed hitting a trough. For a moment, the barn feels less like a building and more like a living machine kept running by routine. Feeding stock in winter is slow work. Hay must be cut or pitched, grain measured, frozen latches worked open with stiff fingers, animals watched for signs of weakness, a horse that is not drinking enough, a calf separated from the others, a ewe standing oddly. You become alert to small changes because winter punishes delay. Problems that might be manageable in mild weather can turn serious very quickly in cold. The body of an animal, like the body of a person, has limits, and winter enjoys testing them with tedious persistence. The labor of watering animals can be worse than feeding them. Troughs freeze, ice must be chopped, buckets slosh against numb hands, steam rises where warm breath meets bitter air. If you are near a stream or pond, getting animals to water in icy conditions is its own awkward business. If you rely on hauled water, you measure the day in trips and wait. A bucket seems perfectly reasonable until it has to be carried across rutted frozen ground before sunrise. Then it begins to reveal character. Mostly bad character. Inside the house, winter work continues without any kindly pause. Meals need cooking, clothing needs mending, wet things need drying, floors need sweeping, though dirt and straw continue entering with almost theatrical confidence. Lamps need trimming, ashes need emptying, beds need airing when possible, children need washing, or at least vigorous negotiation in the direction of the washing. Illness does not delay the work. Pregnancy does not delay it much. Fatigue certainly does not. Frontier households ran on a grim little principle. If you can stand up, you can probably be handed something useful. Women often bore a relentless double burden in winter, managing domestic labour while also assisting with outdoor work whenever needed. Historical accounts from Western settlements repeatedly show women hauling fuel, carrying water, milking, feeding stock, gardening when possible, nursing the sick, sewing, preserving food, baking, cleaning, and caring for children, all within the same freezing season. The phrase housework sounds far too polite for it. These were systems of survival, not dainty chores performed between cups of tea and gentle reflection. Children joined the labour early, not because frontier adults were cruel by design, but because survival invited very few idle spectators. Boys and girls both carried kindling, gathered chips, fetched eggs, watched younger siblings, filled buckets, ran messages, held animals, and helped stuff cracks or shake out frozen bedding. Their hands reddened, their noses ran, their boots were often the wrong size. Yet children also developed astonishing competence in these tasks. On the frontier, capability arrived young. Childhood was still present. Of course. It simply wore work clothes and had cold fingers. A quirky little truth of winter labour is how many household objects acquired second and third jobs. A chair held drying clothes. A shovel moved snow, ashes, and feed. An old kettle heated washwater one day and animal mash the next. A wagon was transport, storage, windbreak, an occasional temporary repair bench. Nothing stayed in one category for long. The frontier despised single-purpose thinking. If a thing could do two jobs badly, it often did both until further notice. Repair work never ends. A strap snaps in the cold. Leather stiffens and cracks. A gate loosens. Harness needs oiling. A roof edge lifts. A stovepipe shifts. A sled runner splits. Tools disappear into snow with a talent that feels almost malicious. You crouch in the yard or by the barn door with numb fingers trying to mend something that was certainly built by a person who never had to repair it in January. Winter maintenance is full of muttered opinions. Calm historical opinions, naturally. But opinions nonetheless. Fences become especially troublesome. Snow drifts against them, livestock press into them, and frost works at posts in ways that make solid things suddenly less trustworthy. On the open range and in enclosed fields alike, fencing mattered. It kept animals in, predators or wandering stock out, and property lines meaningful. A broken fence in winter is not an aesthetic problem. It is the opening act of a very long day. You trudge out with tools, wire, and stiff hands, hearing the wind comb the grass tops and the occasional hollow ring of metal against frozen wood. Then there is the constant business of keeping people and gear from freezing into uselessness. Gloves are rotated near the stove, blankets are aired, boots are cleaned, greased, stuffed, or cursed depending on need. Milk must not freeze if it can be helped. Eggs must not crack. Water pails near the door are watched. Food stores are checked for spoilage, mice, dampness, or cold damage. Winter work includes many smaller acts whose entire purpose is preventing a larger failure later. This is not glamorous labour. It is preventative annoyance, which is still labour all the same. Historians still argue about how much frontier people later romanticise their winter workloads, especially in memoirs written with a tone of pride or nostalgia. Some accounts seem almost suspiciously cheerful about endless chores, as if frozen laundry and barn repairs were charming proofs of character. Yet farm records, letters, and diaries often reveal real exhaustion, irritation, and physical strain beneath the later polish. The work was meaningful, yes. It was also relentless. Those two truths lived side by side in many Western lives. Weather reshapes the schedule constantly. A calm morning might allow hauling, chopping, and repairs. A rising wind pushes everyone toward quicker essential tasks. A storm warning means feed must be moved, fuel brought in, paths cleared, and outdoor jobs trimmed to the unavoidable minimum. Winter planning is therefore both rigid and flexible. You follow routines, but you hold them loosely enough to pivot when the sky changes. A person who insists on summer habits in winter is basically volunteering for humiliation. Sound plays a strange role in the workday. There is the scrape of a shovel over packed snow, the metallic knock of an axe head, the creak of wagon wheels in cold weather, the clatter of a bucket against a trough, the soft tearing sound of hay flakes pulled apart. Indoors, there is the rhythmic thump of dough, the sweep of a broom, the clink of crockery, the hiss of something spilled onto hot iron. Each sound marks another task in motion. A frontier home in winter is rarely silent. It is busy in a steady, tired, determined way. The body keeps a memory of all this labour. Your shoulders know the feel of yokes, pails, and sacks. Your hands know where the skin will split first. Knees ache differently after chopping than after scrubbing. The back stiffens after lifting feed. Fingertips burn when thawing after outdoor work. Then go right back outside again because the chores are not yet done. Touch becomes a record. Rough handle, wet rope, grain sacks, hot stove iron, frozen gate latch, dry hay scratching the wrists. Winter leaves its notes everywhere. There are, naturally, moments of absurdity. A chicken escapes and chooses the worst weather to become athletic. A pig refuses perfect logic. A calf discovers the exact weak spot in your patience. A bucket handle snaps only when full. A line of laundry freezes into rigid flags. You stand there for 1 second in the wind, looking at some ridiculous failure, and laughter arrives not because things are funny exactly, but because the alternative would be staging a dramatic monologue to the snow. Humour helps. The cold hates being laughed at. Meals are fitted around labour rather than the reverse. You eat quickly because chores remain. You swallow something hot and head back out. By evening, the fatigue has a specific frontier shape. Clothes smell of barn, smoke, and weather. Calves of your legs ache from trudging through drifts or frozen mud. The house feels both cramped and merciful. Supper lands in the body like rescue. Yet even then, tasks linger. A lantern to fill, a coat to dry, a child to settle, a fire to bank. Winter allows no true off-shift. There is also the mental work of managing risk. Which animal worries you most? Whether the roof can handle another snowfall, whether there is enough feed to carry through, whether the well or creek will remain usable, whether someone in the house is beginning to cough in a way you do not like. These concerns travel with the chores and settle beside them. Physical labour may tire the muscles, but uncertainty tires the mind in its own persistent way. On the frontier, you carry both. Still, routine itself becomes a kind of shelter. Rise, dress, fire, water, feed, repair, cook, mend, check, carry, sweep, lift, return, repeat. The pattern is exhausting, but it steadies the mind because it offers shape to days that might otherwise feel ruled entirely by weather. Winter can be huge and impersonal outside. Inside the work, it becomes something you answer one task at a time. By night, when the final outdoor steps are taken and the door closes again behind you, there is a brief sense of account settled for the day. Not finished, never finished, but settled. The animals are fed. The water stands ready. The tools are inside. Damp gloves steam by the stove. Someone yawns. Someone rubs aching wrists. The room glows in that tired golden way only evening firelight can manage. You know dawn will ask for everything again. That is precisely why this hour feels so precious. This is what winter labour really means in the Old West. Not heroic gestures on a dramatic skyline, but constant necessary work done in cold air. dim light and stiff clothing by people too tired to be romantic about it. The season does not pause your life. It becomes the condition under which all life must continue, and so you keep moving, because the animals need you, the house needs you, the family needs you, and the morning will not be any kinder for being ignored tonight. After enough storm days and shortened afternoons, the hardest thing in winter is not always the cold. Sometimes it is the closeness. The house that protects you from wind and snow also keeps you sealed inside with the same faces, the same noises, the same creaking boards, and the same unhelpful chair that catches your shin every evening as if it has developed a petty grudge. The frontier teaches you many noble lessons. One of them is that affection can survive confinement, though not always gracefully, outside. The world may look wide beyond measure. Inside, your life can shrink to one room, one stove, one table, one lamp, and a set of routines so familiar they begin to feel carved into the floorboards. The air carries the usual household smells: smoke, wool, lamp oil, cooked beans, damp leather, old wood, and that faint human warmth that builds when several people live close together through a long season. At first, the room feels safe. Then, on certain evenings, it feels smaller than it did yesterday. Not physically smaller, of course. Emotionally, which is sometimes worse. Isolation in the Old West was not an occasional inconvenience for many winter settlers. It was a structural fact of life. Homes could lie miles apart. Roads turned uncertain. Rivers iced. Mud-trapped wagons. Snow-blocked travel. Letters came slowly if they came at all. News from towns, relatives, politics, markets, and the wider world arrived late and thin. A person might spend days or weeks seeing only household members and livestock. That kind of distance affects the mind in quiet ways. You begin to listen more sharply to small sounds because there is so little newness to distract you. One broad historical reality appears in many diaries and memoirs from Western settlements. Winter isolation weighed heavily on mental and emotional life, especially for women, children, and anyone living far from town or neighbours. The loneliness could be intensified by hard labour, sickness, grief, childbirth, or the simple monotony of indoor confinement. Frontier stories often celebrate toughness, but the private emotional cost of remote living was real. People missed conversation, missed company, missed variety, and missed the ordinary reassurance of being part of a larger human world. A winter evening indoors can feel calm at first. The lamp burns low and yellow. Needles move through cloth. A pot simmers. Someone reads from a Bible, newspaper, almanac, or old book if the household owns one. Boots dry by the stove with a smell that is almost aggressive in its damp sincerity. The wind rubs along the outside wall. A child leans against a chair and grows drowsy. For an hour, the whole arrangement seems peaceful enough. Then a spoon drops. Someone sighs too loudly. A baby cries. A board creaks overhead, and suddenly the room feels full of nerves. Cabin fever is a modern phrase for an old condition. You do not need scientific language to recognize it. Restlessness gathers in the limbs. Patience thins. Small irritations enlarge with suspicious speed. Someone chews too loudly. Someone leaves the door open 1 second too long. Someone sits too near the best light for mending. Someone else tracks in snow. The offence is tiny, the reaction disproportionate, and everyone knows it. That does not stop it from happening. The frontier did not create human tempers. It merely gave them fewer exits. Children often suffered and entertained themselves in the same breath. They were bored, curious, noisy, inventive, and not always easy to contain within a small winter room. Toys might be simple and scarce. A rag doll, carved animals, marbles if any remained, scraps turned into games, stories turned into bigger stories, a stick used indoors against parental advice, floor patterns studied as if secret maps were hidden in the grain. Children can make a kingdom from nearly nothing, which is fortunate, because frontier households rarely provided an excess of approved amusement. There were songs, of course, hymns, ballads, folk tunes carried from older homes and different countries. Singing could lift a room almost instantly, especially when darkness arrived early and the weather trapped everyone inside. A fiddle, if a household owned one, was nearly miraculous. A harmonica or mouth harp could do useful emotional work too. The sound of live music in a small frontier room must have felt larger than the room itself, stretching the walls without moving them. Even a single familiar tune could loosen the tightness in everyone's faces for a while. Reading aloud held special power where books or newspapers were available. A worn novel, a family Bible, a magazine, a joke column, a sermon, farming advice, a sensational old tale about bandits or shipwrecks. It all counted. The actual quality of the material mattered less than the fact of shared attention. One voice, one lamp, many listeners, pages turning in a room that otherwise hears only wind. That is a deeply human scene, and winter made it precious. Not every household had books to spare, of course. Where reading matter existed, it was often read and reread until the phrases settled into memory. A quirky tidbit from Western winter life is how seriously people could take simple indoor entertainments. Charades, spelling games, recitations, homemade riddles, checkers, card games, and guessing contests were not trivial filler. They were emotional equipment. A family might replay the same game so many times that every trick and argument became predictable, yet still return to it because predictability was part of the comfort. In a season when weather kept rewriting daily plans, a familiar game with familiar rules could feel wonderfully fair. Touch changes under confinement too, a shawl tucked tighter around your shoulders, a child curled asleep against an adult's arm, rough wool brushing past in a narrow space, knuckles resting on a warm mug, the smooth worn edge of a chair where hands have landed 1,000 times, the dry crackle of cards shuffled by lamplight, the weight of a quilt over knees in the evening. These are quiet physical details, but they shape the emotional texture of the season. Loneliness may exist in the room with you, yet so does closeness, literal and constant. That closeness can easily turn to friction. Privacy is scarce in many frontier homes, especially one-room dwellings. There is little chance to be alone with your thoughts unless you go outside, which winter often punishes. Grief cannot hide easily. Irritation cannot disperse elegantly. Marital tensions, parental worry, adolescent moods, and ordinary adult fatigue all circulate through the same warm air. A person might sew faster, stir a pot more sharply, or become oddly intent on tidying simply to have somewhere to place unsettled feeling. The room absorbs everything. There is nowhere else for it to go. Women in particular could feel the pressure of isolation intensely. Many memoirs and letters hint at long stretches without adult female company, limited chances to visit neighbours, and the strain of managing children and household work without relief. Men might leave for herding, hauling, or errands, but women were often expected to remain and hold everything together indoors. Some did so with remarkable steadiness. Some confessed to despair, tears, or a numb kind of endurance. Both responses belong to the frontier record, whether later family stories admitted them or not. Men, meanwhile, often carried a different form of winter strain. Long weather delays, limited travel, money worries, feed shortages, and the burden of appearing competent under pressure could grind at the nerves. A man expected to be practical and composed may have found himself pacing a small room, checking weather signs through the window, or sharpening tools that did not need sharpening just to convert anxiety into motion. The frontier praised self-command, but the season gave everyone reasons to feel trapped. Historians still debate how much 19th century people described emotional hardship directly, because many left sparse records or used indirect language shaped by the values of their time. Loneliness, melancholy, nerves, and discouragement do appear in diaries and letters, yet not always in the modern vocabulary of mental health. Some emotions had to be inferred from tone, omission, or the sheer repetition of weary details. The absence of dramatic confession does not mean the strain was absent. It may simply have worn different clothes in the written record. Visitors broke the spell of monotony like weather of a friendlier sort. A neighbour stopping by could transform the entire household atmosphere. Coats shook off by the door, new voices, News from another farm or town, fresh gossip, borrowed tools returned, a shared meal or cup, children suddenly lively, adults sitting straighter, speaking faster, laughing more easily. The scent of outside cold comes in with guests, sharp and clean, before it blends with indoor smoke and warmth. That contrast alone feels exciting. Human variety becomes its own luxury. Not every visit was cheerful, of course. News could bring worry, illness, death, failed crops, stolen stock, debt, weather damage, marriages, births, disputes, all travelled from household to household in winter conversation. Still, even troubling news reminded you that life existed beyond your walls. The wider community did not vanish simply because the road was difficult. You remained part of something larger, and that mattered more than people sometimes admitted. Religion also provided structure for many frontier households through the winter. Prayer, scripture reading, hymns, and Sabbath routines offered not only belief but rhythm. In isolated settings, rhythm has real value. It divides time. It gives shape to the week. It reminds the mind that not every day is merely another cold version of the last one. Whether in deep conviction or quiet habit, these observances could steady a room and soften the emotional edges of confinement. Sometimes, though, there is no noble answer to boredom. People simply endure it. They stare into the stove. They count stitches. They sort nails. They rewrite lists in their heads. They peel potatoes with excessive seriousness. They watch children play the same game again. They listen to the wind and wish for spring. There is something almost honest about these dull hours. They reveal frontier life not as constant adventure, but as ordinary human waiting stretched thin by weather and distance. The house at night can feel strangely intimate then. Firelight flickers across patched walls. Shadows of moving hands slide over the ceiling. The lamp hums softly. A kettle lid trembles. Someone yawns so deeply it becomes contagious. Another person shifts under a blanket with the rustle of heavy cloth. The warmth near the stove contrasts with the cold lurking at the edges of the room. You feel both protected and hemmed in, comforted and confined at once. That double feeling is one of winter's most persistent truths. Yet people developed quiet methods of coping. They created routines, games, songs, stories, tasks, and tiny treats. They visited when possible. They read, mended, planned gardens, carved toys, braided rugs, wrote letters, told jokes, and watched the weather as if it were theatre. They took comfort where they found it. The Old West did not offer endless entertainment, but it did foster resourcefulness of mind as well as hand. When the landscape outside became blank and hard, the inner life had to provide some of its own colour. By the end of a long winter evening, the emotional weather of the house may have settled again. Tempers cool. Children droop with sleep. Adults return to quieter voices. The chair that was intolerable an hour ago becomes just a chair once more. A shawl is pulled up. A book closes. Ashes are shifted. The stove glows red behind its door. Outside, the dark lies deep over the plain. Inside, for all the confinement, there is still company, and that matters. This is what isolation really means in the Old West. Not grand wilderness solitude in a painting, but a slow narrowing of daily life that could strain the nerves even while it deepened household bonds. Winter shut doors, lengthened nights, and made every voice inside the room more important. People grew irritable, inventive, lonely, affectionate, weary, and funny by turns. They learned that survival was not only about fuel, food, and walls. It was also about mood, patience, and the delicate frontier art of not throwing a spoon at the person you love because they have hummed the same tune for the 12th time since supper. By the hardest stretch of winter, one lesson becomes impossible to ignore. However fiercely the frontier praises independence, survival often depends on other people. A blizzard does not care about your pride. A sick child does not improve because you prefer privacy. A broken wagon, a short woodpile, a missing cow, or a buried road can force even the most stubborn soul to admit that the nearest neighbour is not merely a neighbour. In winter, that person may be the thin line between a difficult week and a disaster. The old Western ideal of standing alone has a certain dramatic charm. It looks very handsome in paintings, especially if nobody asks who helped dig the well, raise the roof, find the doctor, or search for stock after a storm. Real life in winter is less theatrical and much more cooperative. Roads vanish, distances grow heavier, time matters more. Under such conditions, help acquires a sharp practical value. You can admire self-reliance all you like, but when the barn roof shifts under wet snow, admiration will not hold up the beams. A knock at the door on a winter evening carries unusual force. Sound travels differently through the season. The room is close, warm, and lamp-lit. Then suddenly there is the thud of boots on the step, a hand at the latch, a blast of cold air, and a figure standing in the doorway trailing frost and weather. Coats are shaken. Snow drops onto the floorboards. The room smells instantly of outside, sharp wind, horse sweat, damp wool, and the clean metallic scent of deep cold. Even before a word is spoken, the whole house changes shape around a visitor. One broad historical fact appears again and again across frontier settlements. Neighbours often depended on one another for winter labour and emergency response, especially in isolated rural districts where formal services barely existed or were too distant to matter quickly. People borrowed teams, shared tools, checked on households after storms, helped with childbirth, nursed the sick, and formed search parties when someone failed to return. Mutual aid was not sentimental decoration. It was part of the operating system of life in the Old West. You see this most clearly after severe weather. Snow drifts high across paths and yards. Fences lie hidden. Doors need digging out. A family short of fuel may need immediate help. A widow, an elderly settler, or a household hit by illness could fall behind dangerously fast if left alone. So neighbours arrive with shovels, axes, teams, sleds, or simply strong backs and more experience than you have. The sound of scraping metal, muffled voices outside, and horses blowing into the cold yard can be as reassuring as the glow of the stove. Rescue sometimes begins with nothing more glamorous than a group of tired people deciding to show up. This does not mean frontier communities were uniformly gentle or harmonious. Far from it. People argued over landlines, water rights, debt, grazing, politics, religion, and livestock with impressive energy. They could be suspicious, proud, nosy, and capable of holding grudges through several seasons and at least one fence repair. Yet winter imposed its own discipline. You might dislike a man in October and still hitch your team to help him in January if his wife was ill, or his children needed bringing into town. The weather did not erase human tensions. It simply reminded everyone that some quarrels mattered less than frozen roads. Searches in winter carried a special dread. When someone went missing in snow or failed to return by dark, neighbours often organised quickly because delay could be fatal. Lanterns were lit, horses saddled or sleds prepared. Men called to one another in the yard while women packed food, blankets, extra scarves, hot stones, or whatever practical comforts could be sent along. The sounds were urgent but not chaotic. A frontier search party relied on local knowledge, tracks if any remained, likely routes, and grim experience. Every passing hour seemed louder than the wind. A quirky detail from frontier community life is how often hospitality blurred into emergency logistics. A guest might arrive intending only a brief visit and end up staying the night because weather made return impossible. Beds were rearranged. Blankets appeared. Children were shifted around like chess pieces. Horses were stabled if possible. Supper stretched. Coffee strengthened. Hospitality in winter was not always about entertaining. It was frequently about absorbing inconvenience without ceremony, because the season had made ordinary travel unreasonable. A crowded room and a full stove beat a lonely road every time. Women often formed especially crucial support networks, though their labour was not always recorded with the same drama as a mounted rescue. They sat with the sick, assisted at births, lent yeast or flour, shared patterns, exchanged remedies, and passed along practical knowledge that made winter life more manageable. A neighbour woman arriving with broth, clean cloths, or calm experience could change the entire outcome of a household crisis. The frontier liked to celebrate rugged men on horseback, But many families survived winter because women carried community through kitchens, sick rooms, and back doors. Children also moved through these networks in revealing ways. They were sent with messages, borrowed ingredients, or small returned items. They learned who could be trusted, whose barn had a room, whose mother baked the best bread, and which house would always take in a traveller. In this way, as community became concrete long before it became philosophical. A child might not care much about civic virtue, but that child understood perfectly well which neighbour had once appeared with help when the well froze or the cow calved badly in a storm. The touch of shared labour feels different from solitary work. 2 or 3 people lifting a beam, several hands passing buckets, a neighbour steadying a horse while you adjust a strap, gloves bumping in the cold, coats brushing in a narrow entryway, a shovel handle passed from one numb hand to another. These small physical exchanges carry a kind of wordless trust. You stop pretending you can manage every task alone because there is no time for theatrical pride. The beam must be moved, the drift must be cut through, the child must be fetched from town. Hands are what matter. Rescue those could arrive from strangers as well as neighbours. Travellers caught by weather might be taken in by households they had never seen before. Ranch hands, teamsters, soldiers, indigenous guides, traders, and passing settlers all entered the winter record in this way. Not every encounter was safe or comfortable, and frontier caution was sensible. Still, many recollections preserve the memory of unexpected kindness offered with little fuss. A place by the stove, a bowl of stew, space in the barn, directions for a safer route. In a hard season, even brief decency could feel enormous. Historians still debate how cohesive frontier communities truly were, because much depends on region, ethnicity, class, religion, and the stage of settlement. Some districts developed dense habits of cooperation and reciprocal aid. Others remained fragmented, suspicious, or highly unequal, with certain households carrying more burden than others. The romantic idea of perfect neighbourliness is too neat. So is the opposite idea of universal selfishness. Winter communities were usually mixed, practical, and shaped by necessity as much as by affection. The emotional effect of being helped is complicated. Relief comes first, certainly, then gratitude. Sometimes embarrassment follows close behind. Pride can smart when another person notices your short fuel pile, weak roof, or lack of provisions. The frontier often taught people to conceal vulnerability until concealment no longer worked. A neighbour arriving with assistance might feel like comfort and exposure at once. Yet most adults understood the bargain beneath the awkwardness. You accept help now because next month the burden may shift and the wagon at your door may be yours. Church gatherings, town meetings, school events, and seasonal visits could strengthen these bonds when roads allowed. Even brief shared occasions helped people measure who was doing well, who looked tired, who had lost weight, whose children needed boots, who had been absent too long, and who might require checking on after the next storm. Community surveillance sounds severe, but on the frontier it could shade into care. People watched each other because life was visible and because in winter, not being seen at all could become dangerous. There were also organised efforts when crisis demanded them. A family burned out. Someone fell ill beyond what one household could manage. A widow lacked fuel. In such cases, communities might gather wood, food, labour, or money with surprising speed. The practical nature of these gestures is what gives them weight, not speeches, not grand declarations. Firewood stacked by the door, bread left on the table, a roof patched, a road broken open. The Old West could be harsh, but it also produced forms of generosity that looked like work. Not all aid crossed social lines equally, and that matters. Prejudice, suspicion, and unequal power shaped who received help, who was welcomed, and whose hardships were ignored. Immigrants, indigenous people, poor labourers, and marginalised families did not always benefit from community concern in the same way as more established settlers. Winter did not erase those lines. Sometimes it exposed them more clearly. Still, the general truth remains that no one, however respected, was entirely beyond the need for others when the season turned severe. A house full of helpers has its own atmosphere. Steam rises from coats thawing by the stove. Voices overlap. Boots crowd the doorway. Someone laughs from sheer effort. Someone coughs. Tools lean against the wall. The room smells of sweat, snow, leather, coffee, and smoke. A pot gets stretched to feed extra mouths. Chairs scrape. The lamp burns later than usual. There is fatigue everywhere, but also motion and purpose, and these can brighten a winter room more effectively than any fine decoration. Shared labour creates a distinct warmth, one that the stove helps but does not fully explain. Sometimes the help is small and no less meaningful for that: a borrowed sack of flour, a little lamp oil, directions to a sheltered crossing, news that a doctor is already on the road, a warning about thin ice, the loan of a team for one day, advice on banking a fire or wrapping a frozen limb. Frontier life was built from such exchanges. They were easy to overlook in bold retellings because they lacked drama, yet taken together, they formed the web that kept many households from slipping into deeper trouble. There is a certain irony in all this, and winter seems to enjoy it. The same frontier culture that celebrates standing alone also leaves abundant evidence that people survived by clustering, sharing, lending, visiting, warning, and rescuing. Independence remained a cherished ideal, but winter translated ideals into practice, and practice usually required company. Not constant company, perhaps just enough human presence at the right moment to matter. By the time a hard season reaches its deepest point, you can hear that truth in the very sounds around you. A sleigh bell approaching through the cold, voices calling from the yard, a knock after dark, a horse snorting outside your door, the scrape of neighbours' boots crossing your threshold. These are not interruptions to frontier life. They are part of its hidden structure. Without them, many households would have been left to weather the season alone in more ways than one. This is what winter community really means in the Old West. Not sentimental perfection, but practical interdependence shaped by need, tempered by pride, and made visible whenever weather pushed people to their limits. Neighbours could quarrel, strangers could unsettle, and kindness could arrive with awkwardness attached. Yet when the snow deepened, the road disappeared, or trouble struck at the worst hour. Human beings kept turning toward one another with tools, blankets, teams, food, and open doors. On the frontier, survival was rarely as solitary as the legend prefers to remember. At last, winter begins to loosen not with a grand announcement, but with small betrayals. Snowbanks slump at the edges. The roof drips in the afternoon. A patch of dark earth appears near the doorway and looks almost shocking, as if the land has remembered a forgotten colour. The air still bites in the morning, yet by midday it carries a softness that makes you suspicious. The Old West has taught you not to trust comfort too quickly. A mild afternoon can still turn sharp by sundown. Even so, something in the season is changing, and every person, animal, wall, and wagon on the place seems to feel it. You notice it first in sound. Water begins to move. Not much at first. A faint trickle under packed snow, a drip from the eaves, a soft collapse where crusted ice gives way at the edge of a trough. Birds become bolder. Mud makes its first rude entrance, slurping under boots where solid ground behaved with more dignity. The wind still comes, but it no longer always sounds like an enemy. Some days it carries the smell of wet earth instead of nothing but iron cold. That smell lifts the mind instantly, after months of smoke, leather, hay, and frost. Thaw has its own perfume, messy, damp, beautiful. Yet the end of winter is not easy. It is only different. The snow withdraws and leaves work behind, as though the season is departing without clearing its plates. Fences lean where drifts pressed them. Roofs reveal loose boards and leaks. Water damage appears in walls. Mud thickens around barns and paths. Feed stores look smaller than you hoped. Animals emerge gaunter, rough-coated, and impatient for grass that is not yet ready. You look over the property with a tired eye and see not deliverance, but a list. One widely recognized fact of frontier life is that the approach of spring often brought relief mixed with fresh hardship. Thaw could mean mud, disease, flooding, unstable roads, and difficult travel long before it meant comfort. The sentimental idea of spring as simple rescue makes sense only if you have never tried moving a wagon through axle-deep mud while worrying about weak stock and a roof that leaked all night. On the frontier, every season arrived carrying both promise and paperwork. Your body feels the length of winter by now. Hands remain rough even in softer air. Knuckles hold pale scars where skin split and healed badly. Shoulders remember every bucket and bale. The face in a bit of mirror glass or a dark window looks older than it did when the first frosts came. Not dramatically older, quietly older. The kind of change that settles around the eyes, in the way you stand, and in how quickly you calculate practical risks without needing to think much about it. Winter has instructed the body with constant repetition, and the lesson stays. Clothing tells the story too. Coats bear shiny wear at the cuffs. Socks are thinner, patched again, and a little defeated. Gloves have taken on the shape of hard use. Boots carry salt marks, mud stains, cracks beginning at the flex points, and soles that seem to question your loyalty. Nothing has escaped unchanged. The house has not escaped either. The stove still stands as the hard heart of the room, but the walls bear smoke, wear, and handprints from months of close living. The table has hosted economy, fatigue, visitors, quarrels, mending, prayer, and endless plain meals. Objects gain a moral weight by surviving winter alongside you. Animals respond to the shifting season with a kind of visible impatience. Horses lift their heads higher in the milder air. Cattle bawl more, sensing movement in the world beyond feed and shelter. Chickens begin behaving as if they have personally negotiated the return of lighter days. Dogs become muddier, happier, and harder to keep out from underfoot. Even the barn changes character. The smell remains earthy and warm, but now it mingles with damp straw, thawing wood, and the beginning of churned spring muck. Winter's deep stillness has passed. Everything is stirring, though not neatly. Food tastes different near the season's turn. The same beans, bread, bacon, and coffee are touched by hope now, which is a surprisingly powerful seasoning. You may still be rationing. You may still eye the flour sack with caution. But if a little dried fruit remains, if some preserved apples can be opened, if a hen has resumed laying with greater enthusiasm, the table brightens. The first fresh flavours of a new season can feel almost emotional. A bit of green, a little milk, something not salted or dried to a stern old age. The body remembers instantly what it has missed. A quirky frontier truth is that spring mud could inspire nearly as much complaint as winter snow. After months of frozen hardship, you might expect gratitude to carry everyone sweetly into the thaw. Instead, people often found themselves ankle-deep in slime, hauling stuck wheels, scrubbing filthy floors, and muttering at roads that dissolved into brown uncertainty. It is almost endearing. Human beings can endure a season of brutal cold and then become deeply offended by mud. Perhaps this is wisdom. Perhaps it is fatigue in a new costume. Work changes, but does not lessen. Paths must be reopened or reshaped. Meltwater redirected. Bedding aired. Clothing washed more thoroughly if fuel and sun allow. Seed plans reviewed. Harness repaired. Wagons inspected. Tools sharpened. Fields considered with a mixture of hunger and caution. The whole place seems to wake in sections, and each waking part demands attention. Winter labour was about persistence. Spring labour becomes about recovery and preparation, which is just persistence with more mud on it. Children feel the change with the quickest joy. They hear water running and want to be outdoors immediately. They find every puddle. They return with knees wet, boots caked, and faces bright from air that no longer cuts so viciously. Their noise changes too. Winter indoor voices have a contained quality, shaped by walls and lamplight. Thaw brings louder sounds, running feet, shouted discoveries, laughter carried across the yard. The house expands emotionally before it expands physically. The season gives children room first, and adults feel the relief through them. The mind also loosens. The long winter habits do not vanish at once, but they begin to uncoil. You stop listening quite so tensely to the night wind. You worry less about the fuel pile. You leave the door open 1 second longer. Light lingers into the evening, and the room looks changed by that extra hour. Shadows fall differently. Tasks once done under lamplight now finish by a pale, natural glow. It is astonishing how much emotional weight a little more daylight can carry. It reaches into corners that winter had claimed as its own. Historians still debate how much later writing exaggerated the triumphant emotional release of spring, because memory enjoys neat endings and winter rarely provides them. Some memoirs describe the first signs of thaw with almost biblical feeling. Others are more subdued, stressing damage, hunger, and exhaustion that did not disappear with the ice. Both responses ring true. A hard winter's end may feel glorious and disappointing at the same time. The season withdraws, but it leaves its fingerprints on every plan. There is relief in surviving, yes, but survival does not arrive wrapped in celebration for everyone. Some households reach thaw with losses, animals gone, savings spent, clothing ruined, health weakened, grief carried in silence. Not every spring begins equally. That too is part of the frontier truth. A season can be endured and still cost too much. Yet even then, the return of light, thaw, and movement offers a form of permission. You may be tired, poorer, sadder, and still willing to begin again because the land itself has shifted from refusal to possibility. Community stirs with the roads. Neighbours reappear more easily. Wagons attempt routes abandoned through deep winter. News begins moving again. Fences are discussed. Borrowed tools returned, and practical gossip gains speed. Whose calves survived? Who needs lumber? Which crossing is passable? Who has seed to spare? Who looks worn thin? Winter's isolation loosens, and with it comes a renewed sense of belonging to a wider pattern of effort. The world beyond your doorway had never fully vanished, but now it becomes reachable again in ordinary ways. Inside the house, winter's habits linger like old smoke in the rafters. You still bank the fire carefully. You still count supplies. You still lay out clothes with the practical eye of someone who has had cold fingers too often. But now the window may stand open a crack. Bedding can be aired. Floors can be scrubbed and dried more easily. The scent of the room changes as damp cold gives way to fresh air, soap, earth, and mud tracked in from outside. It is hardly a grand perfume, but it is alive. There is a particular feeling in standing outdoors at dusk during the change of season. The ground is uneven underfoot, part thaw, part firmness. A little breeze brushes your face and does not sting. Somewhere water is moving. The sky holds more colour than winter usually allowed itself. A horse crops at the first poor tuft of emerging grass as if it were a feast. Smoke rises from the chimney in a softer line. You look at the house, the barn, the yard, the fences, and you know precisely how much labour they required. You also know they are still here. So are you. That knowledge matters. The Old West often gets remembered in bold myths, but real survival leaves subtler marks. It teaches thrift without speeches, patience without glamour, and humour sharpened by necessity. It teaches you how much comfort lives in small things. A dry pair of stockings, a full water bucket, a roof that holds, a stew that stretches, a knock from a neighbour, a stove that keeps drawing. By the end of winter, you do not need grand philosophy to understand life better. You need only remember what you learned while keeping warm. The hardest season strips away vanity. It shows what a house truly does, what food really means, what work costs, and how quickly pride bends when weather grows serious. It also reveals a stubborn human talent for adaptation. People patch, borrow, mend, joke, ration, share, endure, and wake up to do it again. That is less shiny than legend. Perhaps. It is also more impressive. Anyone can admire heroism in bright sunlight. The deeper test is what a person becomes during a freezing morning when the fire is low and the chores still wait. As the thaw spreads, do you begin taking the measure of what winter carved into you? Not just fatigue, not only relief, something steadier. a plain confidence built from repeated necessity. You know now what you can carry, what you can spare, how far a food store stretches, how quickly weather turns, how loudly loneliness can speak, and how powerful a little kindness becomes in a hard season. These are not lessons written in books first. They are written into hands, routines, and memory. So the end of winter in the Old West is not a trumpet blast. It is a slow return of sound, mud, light, birds, dripping roofs, restless animals, and people stepping back into motion with clothes still smelling faintly of smoke. The season leaves behind patched walls, worn gloves, repaired harness, emptied barrels, tired backs, and a sharpened respect for every ordinary comfort. You do not emerge untouched. You emerge instructed, and that may be the clearest truth of all. Winter has survived one day at a time, but understood only when the thaw reveals what it demanded. It asked for labor, restraint, patience, and no small amount of nerve. It asked people to depend on walls, fire, food, fabric, neighbors, and one another in ways easy weather never requires. When at last the land softens and the sky holds longer light, you stand within a world still rough, still uncertain, and still deeply beautiful, knowing that the season has taken its share but failed to take everything. The evening settles now with a gentler hush. The stove glows more softly. The wind has lost its edge. Somewhere beyond the house, water moves through dark ground that has begun, finally, to release its grip. You feel the day easing. The long cold has thinned into memory and mud and fading frost, and the room around you seems quieter for having endured it. Outside, the prairie lies under a softer sky. Inside, the blankets are warm, the boards familiar, and the labor of the season can rest for a little while. You let your shoulders loosen. You let the sounds of the house drift together into something calm, a faint settling of wood, the last low murmur of the fire, a distant animal shifting in its stall. The air no longer bites so sharply at the edges. It simply moves, cool and gentle, through the dark. You can picture the wide land slowly changing color under the first patient touch of spring. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to ease the mind, enough to tell the body that the hardest cold has passed. The house that held against the wind now holds a quieter kind of peace. The table is still, the tools are put by, the door is closed, the night gathers kindly over everything that has been mended, carried, cooked, patched, fed, and saved. And as that quiet deepens, you can let the frontier fade into darkness around you, leaving only warmth, stillness, and the soft comfort of rest at last.